With a bomb strapped to his chest, the brave soldier dashes towards the menacing advance of a German tank. The soldier knows exactly what he was supposed to do. All he had to do was to get beneath the German tank as best as he could. He has nothing to fear because he has flawlessly executed countless missions of this nature during his training. But this time it's different. Little did he know that he wouldn't find any treats under the advancing German tank. Oblivious to the grim reality that awaits him, he ventures under the tank, driven by the promise of a reward that will never come. In an instant, a deafening explosion shatters the silence. He's blown to pieces. No more wagging tail, no bright, eager eyes, no soft belly to rub. Just like that, he vanished, leaving the enemy tank in ruins. Mission accomplished. This was the harsh reality for the Soviet Union's anti-tank dogs, trained for a one-way mission during World War II. It wasn't just the Soviets. The Allies, the Germans, all sides used animals to accomplish missions that were out of reach to humans. Most of these animals faced brutal ends, seen as nothing more than disposable tools of war, but others were used to create weird and outlandish weapons of war. In this video, we unveil 3 secret missions from World War II that saw animals transformed into instruments of war, revealing the lengths to which nations would go to secure victory in the face of desperation. Number 1. Rat bombs. The Special Operations Executive SOE was an organization set up by the British government to sabotage key German targets such as factories, railway stations, and bridges, and support and assist resistant movements in occupied Europe. As the war progressed, the SOE began operating in Asia and North Africa, and also supported direct attacks against German targets, with the SOE notably training the Czechoslovakian resistance fighters who carried out Operation Anthropoid, the plot to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich. Churchill was an enthusiastic advocate of the SOE, offering his full support and instructing the SOE to set Europe ablaze. The SOE also worked to subvert and disrupt the German war effort through the development of special weapons and unconventional tactics. One of the most famous examples of this was the rat bomb, an attempt to destroy and disrupt German infrastructure by spreading dead rats which had been filled with explosives. The SOE planned to covertly distribute such rats around German factories, ports, and railway stations with the aim of getting them into the coal supply used by the Germans. Once the dead rats were discovered, it was believed that many of them would be disposed of by being thrown into a factory furnace or a steam train's boiler. Although each rat bomb only contained a small amount of explosive, if this was detonated within the confines of a furnace or boiler, the results would be devastating, potentially causing a catastrophic explosion. Further plans would see the development of a type of rat bomb which used a time delay device and therefore did not rely on being thrown into a fire to detonate. Rats for this purpose were procured from pest control companies in London by the SOE under the pretense of being needed for experiments that would be carried out in universities. These rats were then filled with explosives at the SOE's laboratory at Aston House in Stevenage, Hertfordshire. An SOE manual from the time describes the process of preparing the rats. The rat is skinned, this skin being sewn up and filled with plastic explosives to assume the shape of a dead rat. A standard number 8 primer is set in the plastic explosive. The rat bomb was never used operationally, as the Germans intercepted the first container of explosive-filled rats before it could be delivered to SOE agents in occupied France. Despite this apparent setback, the existence of rat bombs still caused major problems for the Germans. They had no way of knowing that the container of exploding rats they had found was the first one that the British had sent, and had to assume that there were potentially many thousands of explosive-filled rats already distributed throughout German-occupied territory. This led to massive levels of resources being diverted into searching for dead rats lying around ports, factories, railway stations, and other key areas. A 1999 article in The Guardian quotes an SOE report which states, "This device caused considerable trouble to the enemy, but not quite the way that was intended. They had to search for hundreds of rats the enemy believed were distributed on the continent." In 2017, a rat bomb, which had been recovered from a police station in France in the years immediately after the Second World War, was put up for auction at Bonhams in New York. Sold as Special Operations Executive and Explosive Dummy Rat, the rat bomb was said to have belonged to Maurice Ledain, a French SOE agent who escaped to Britain from occupied France in 1940 and went back to France 3 times during the war to operate behind German lines. According to Bonham's website, the rat bomb sold at the auction for $1,875. Number 2. Bat bombs. The Second World War saw the U.S. invest considerable resources into creating a bat bomb. Such a weapon would consist of a large bomb-shaped canister containing thousands of bats, all of which had been fitted with a small-timed incendiary charge. The canister would be dropped over a Japanese city at dawn by B-24 bombers. Once released, a parachute would deploy and the sides of the canister would then open up, allowing the bats to escape. As the bats were nocturnal and the sun was beginning to rise, they would naturally seek shelter in any buildings they could find. Once the bats were in place inside Japanese buildings, the timed incendiary devices would detonate, causing a small fire which would quickly spread through the Japanese cities where buildings were made mostly out of light materials such as wood and paper rather than brick and concrete. Industrial areas such as factories, processing plants, fuel dumps, and shipyards would also be targeted. The idea to use a bat bomb against the Japanese was thought up by Dr. Lytle Adams, a 60-year-old American dentist and inventor from Pennsylvania who had some knowledge of civil aviation but little experience of military aircraft, explosives, or corruptorology. He had been outraged at the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and was keen to do anything he could to help the American war effort. Seeing how bats roost in the cavern systems in the southern states of the United States gave him the idea of using them as a way of delivering combustible bombs which would devastate urban areas across Japan. Wanting his idea to be taken up at the highest level, Adams wrote to President Roosevelt in 1942 explaining his plans to develop a bat bomb to use against the Japanese. While it would usually be seen as extremely unlikely for a wartime president to read unsolicited mail offerings ideas for unconventional weapons, Adams was an acquaintance of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, which explains how the president eventually saw the letter. Roosevelt was reportedly receptive to the idea, saying, "It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but it's worth looking into," and gave the project his approval. Following Roosevelt's endorsement, the National Defense Research Committee approved the project, and work on developing a viable bat bomb began in early 1943. It would eventually be given the codename Project X-Ray. Adams was allowed to assemble a small team which included the noted American chemist Louis Pfizer and the zoologist Jack C. von Blocker. The Mexican free-tailed bat was chosen as the species of bat that would be used for the project as it was extremely common, being found in vast numbers in the caves and caverns of national parks in states such as Texas and New Mexico. The species of bat is also extremely adaptable and will live and roost in man-made structures, making it ideal for the project. Furthermore, research into other species of bats showed that many bats could carry their offspring from one roost to another. Often, bats would carry several of their young at once, meaning they were carrying a load equal to their body weight. After the tests were completed, Adams and his team calculated that Mexican free-tailed bats would be able to successfully carry a small incendiary charge which could weigh up to an ounce or 28 grams. It was also decided that napalm, which Pfizer had recently invented, would be used in the charges as it was more easily dispersed and burned at a greater temperature than gasoline or phosphorus. As 1943 progressed, plans for the bat bombs progressed. The bats would be gathered from their natural environment using nets, and as long as they were kept at a cool temperature, they'd enter a state of hibernation, allowing the explosive charges to be attached to the bats. They would then be fitted to trays and placed in the canisters, each holding around 1,000 explosive-laden bats. Tests were carried out at the U.S. Army Air Base at Carlsbad, New Mexico, with canisters containing bats being airdropped from various heights to ascertain the optimum altitude to release the bat bombs. During this time, the destructive potential of the bats was established, albeit in embarrassing circumstances for Adams and his team. Some of the bats, which were fitted with live explosive charges, escaped and roosted in the buildings on the Carlsbad base. The explosives fitted to the bats eventually detonated, causing buildings and a hangar to burst into flames. Following this, the ownership of the Bat Bomb project was taken up by the U.S. Navy and then transferred to the Marine Corps and moved up to Dugway Proving Ground site in Utah, a facility established in 1942 to test chemical and biological weapons. Here, tests with the bat bombs produced results which impressed the National Defense Research Committee, and statistical analysis showed that an American bomber carrying half its full capacity of bat bombs could start over 4,700 fires. But the momentum behind the bat bomb project began to stall as it became clear that producing a viable bat bomb which could be deployed over Japan would take much longer than previously thought. Tests continued into 1944, but with an operational bat bomb still at least a year away, the U.S. Navy withdrew funding and ended the project. Conventional firebomb attacks were used against the Japanese with devastating effect. In March 1945, Operation Meeting House, a large-scale firebomb attack, was launched on Tokyo. Around 280 B-29 bombers dropped almost 500,000 incendiary bombs, killing over 100,000 people and destroying tens of thousands of buildings. Adams was, therefore, correct in his belief that incendiary weapons could be used to devastate Japan. And due to its unconventional nature and the difficulties in designing a viable bat bomb, his plans went from presidential approval to stagnation and eventual cancellation. While the specific technical issues the bat bomb team encountered which slowed their progress have not been made entirely clear, several writers have pieced together information to try and explain exactly why the project foundered. In Bat Bomb, World War II's other secret weapon, Jack Cofer says that the Mexican free-tailed bats were in their best physical condition in August and September, meaning that this would be the only feasible time to launch the attack on Japan. When this was missed in 1944, it caused a year-long delay, which eventually led to Project X-Ray's cancellation. A further problem was identified by the journalist and author Al Cimino, who claimed that the bats froze in their canisters due to the altitude they were being carried at by the B-24 bombers. However, the most damning criticism, which places a question mark over the whole bat bomb project, came from William Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War. He ordered Stanley P. Lavelle, the OSS head of research and development, to observe tests of the bat bombs. Lavelle found that when the Air Force released the poor creatures from planes with devices clamped on their backs, they dropped to the earth like stones. Number 3. Anti-tank dogs. Soviet forces began training dogs for anti-tank warfare in the 1930s, with dogs being fitted with explosives and used to destroy, or at least attempt to destroy, German armored vehicles until 1942. Although it's difficult to ascertain the scale of the project, it's believed that tens of thousands of dogs were trained by the Soviets, with the number deployed on the battlefield against German tanks, half-tracks, and other armored vehicles being in the hundreds or thousands. Dogs, primarily German shepherds, would be trained from an early age by conditioning them through food. The dog's food would be placed underneath the Russian tanks so they learned to associate tanks with feeding. The tank's engines would be left running and blank rounds would be fired from the tank's cannon so that the dogs would eventually become accustomed to hearing the sound of gunfire while feeding. When the trainers were confident that the dogs associated tanks with food and were unaffected by the sounds of engines and cannons, they'd be taken to Red Army infantry units and fitted with cloth coats which had large side packets which would be filled with as much as 22 pounds or 10 kilograms of explosives. These explosives were connected to a wooden lever which pointed upwards. This lever would make contact with the body of the tank as the dog ran underneath it, triggering the explosives to detonate. The Soviets believed that the explosion would be sufficient to pierce the lightly armored underside of the tank and disable or destroy the vehicle, killing or seriously injuring the crew inside. The reality of using dogs in this role was somewhat different to what the Soviets envisioned, as the anti-tank dogs did not behave as expected. Dogs would become confused by multiple targets when they were released at advancing German tanks, and as the Soviets had mostly trained dogs with stationary tanks, the dogs did not associate moving tanks with food. Another complication the Soviet forces had failed to account for was that Russian tanks ran on diesel, whereas most German tanks used petrol. As dogs used their sense of smell when searching for food, this caused yet more confusion for the anti-tank dogs. Furthermore, the real-world sounds of battle were very different from the sounds generated during training, meaning that the dogs often panicked and tried to hide or run back to the Soviet lines from which they'd been released. Often, Red soldiers would be forced to open fire on their own dogs as they ran back towards them with undetonated explosives strapped to their sides. The use of anti-tank dogs may have also damaged the morale of Russian soldiers. Many men had become attached to the dogs that they had trained and cared for, and were then badly affected when they had to send these dogs into battle against enemy tanks, knowing the dogs had no chance of survival, or they'd have to shoot their own dogs as they attempted to run back towards them. Germany was also handed a propaganda boost as they were able to report that the Red Army was too afraid to face them and had been reduced to sending dogs into battle instead. While German propaganda claimed that their soldiers had little to no fear from anti-tank dogs, this may have not been the case. In the book Stalingrad, Anthony Beaver describes how Germans initially believed that the anti-tank dogs were first-aid dogs and failed to take any action against them. Once they realized that such dogs were carrying explosives and were being sent out to destroy tanks, the macabre tactic had an unnerving effect on the German soldiers and tank crews, which persisted for the entire conflict. German units on the Eastern Front were therefore ordered to shoot all dogs they encountered on sight. However, the number of German vehicles actually destroyed or seriously damaged by Soviet anti-tank dogs was low, with only a small number of successful engagements confirmed. At the Battle of Kursk, 12 German tanks were reported to have been disabled by Soviet anti-tank dogs, and at the Battle of Stalingrad, 13 German tanks were either destroyed or disabled by dog attacks. This can be seen as a very modest success, as 30,000 to 40,000 dogs had been trained for this purpose by 1941. Overall, the use of anti-tank dogs was considered a failure by the Red Army, and by 1942, the decision was made to stop training dogs to use against tanks, although they were still used as guard dogs and to carry medical equipment and trained to detect mines and explosives.